Tonight on Bridge City News, now that Donald Trump has been impeached, what's next for the U.S. president? Political reporter Lisa Daftari gives us her thoughts. You have seen them in downtown Lethbridge wearing their red shirts. Today we have an update as to how the Watch program is evolving in our city. And Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gives us his thoughts on decriminalizing all drugs as a potential in dealing with the drug crisis in our country.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Robbins.
Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. For only the third time in history, an American president has been impeached. The House of Representatives voted to approve the two articles of impeachment against Donald Trump. They were abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. It stemmed from whether or not Trump improperly sought help from Ukraine to boost his chances of re-election in 2020. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is waiting for the Senate to indicate how it will handle the two articles of impeachment before she transmits them. Pelosi says she hopes there will be a fair process.
No one is above the law, and the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. No one is above the law, and the president has been held accountable. It really is interesting to see the response that we are getting, bipartisan, across party lines. I myself want to say I have a spring in my step because of the moral courage of our caucus. To see them all, so many of 100 members, go to the floor, that's all that we had time for, to go to the floor and speak about our Constitution, about the facts of the case, so clearly, so patriotically.
Trump supporters held a rally in Battle Creek, Michigan, and they say the impeachment vote will not change their minds. There was also those that said the Democrats had to make a statement about the president's conduct.
Trump, no matter where he goes, he just tells it like it is. And that's why I voted for him the first time. That's why I'm going to vote for him again the second time.
When they were actually voting, I kind of felt actually nervous, oh, what's going to happen? And then I did expect the vote to pass for the first article and the second article, so that's pretty exciting. But as I mentioned earlier, I kind of want to hold my excitement until the stuff in the Senate happens, because I think a lot of people are kind of waiting to see what happens there.
Joining me now to discuss the impeachment is U.S. political journalist Lisa Daftari, who's been covering American politics for a number of years now. Lisa, will the two articles make their way to the Senate? And if so, what will happen?
It looks like Nancy Pelosi, as part of her strategy, is holding on before sending them over. And obviously that's, part of the tactic here is to hold them for as long as possible. And that enters the psyche of the American people, whether you were for impeachment or not. And it looks like the country has been 50-50, just like they were on election day 3 years ago. It looks like, that when that word impeachment lingers, it's a stain on the president, regardless of whether or not it passes through Senate, and it probably won't, right? Because we know that there is a Republican majority in Senate that will not allow this to go as far as it has. Once it does reach Senate, what will happen? There'll be a trial. A lot of more details will come out about this, and I don't think that it will hold water.
How will this impact Trump's chances of being reelected in 2020?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, Hal, right? Will we have people on both sides thinking, look, the economy's doing wonderfully, stock market is booming, unemployment has been the lowest possible, and you've had, minority groups that are benefiting from his presidency and from his policies, foreign policy-wise. I mean, he has a few strings left untied, but at the same time, he's going forward with a lot of trade deals, with rearranging the world order. And Hal, you and I speak about this on a weekly basis. So I think if people are truthful and they look at the policies and not look at the candidate that they want to go to lunch with, then I think he has a good chance. A lot of people are frustrated by this impeachment circus. I mean, this is taxpayer money. For 3 years, you have lawmakers on the other side trying to get rid of the guy instead of working along with him and saying, look, my guy wasn't elected into office, but I'm going to make the best of it. I'm going to do what's best for my country. And that's not the sentiment that we get, especially from Congress.
By the way, it was on this day in 1998 that Bill Clinton was impeached, and he was not removed from office. U.S. political reporter Lisa Daftari joining me once again from Los Angeles. Thanks so much, Lisa.
My pleasure, Hal.
Scammers in Canada found a new way of stealing your identity. The Better Business Bureau says the fraudsters are offering free child safety kits that could lead to your child's identity being stolen. The scammers will contact you over the phone, by email, or on social media offering these free kits to kids. A spokesperson with the Bureau says the scammers will ask for your child's full name, address, birth date, and even a social insurance number. Some parents have said that they even insist on meeting the child at their home. The Better Business Bureau says there are ways you can protect yourself and your kids from these scammers. Number one is never give out your child's personal information to a stranger, including their social insurance number. Be suspicious of any unsolicited offers. Legitimate businesses or the government will generally contact you by mail before making any phone calls. Check your child's credit score each year and report any potential fraud. Ensure your child's doctor's office or school keeps their personal information in a safe place. If you think your child is a victim of identity theft, be sure to reach out to local law enforcement right away and get a police report. Every day, teams of volunteers are on foot in 4-hour shifts patrolling the streets of Lethbridge as part of the Watch program. We have an update now as to what's new with the program.
Usually in the summer, there's lots of people outside, there's lots of action outside. We can essentially walk through the downtown and everybody's outside, and that's our job. Now I would say with the winter and the colder weather, our job is more about going into businesses and helping businesses with people inside, or making sure people aren't cold outside, making sure they get a ride with Dot because it's cold out, right? So I would say that our job has just changed in the sense that people are in different places now, and I would say there's not as many people out walking through the downtown as, say, in the summer.
The Watch runs from 10 a.m. till 10 p.m. every day, with team leads and volunteers walking the streets between 6th Avenue South and 5th Avenue North. Along the route, Watch members check in with local business owners for any problems they may be facing. For more than 30 years, the annual Operation Christmas Stocking Project at Chinook Regional Hospital creates one-of-a-kind handmade stockings. They are then stuffed with small gifts to be left at a patient's bedside on Christmas morning.
It's for a good cause. The patients, right now we're working on one for 4A, but we've done some for the psych unit and for ER and so forth. And they're just going to patients who are in the hospital over the Christmas break, and it's just a nice activity to get together.
The stockings are all handmade, and we have to say a great big thank you to especially Lethbridge Centennial Quilters, who donate lots and lots of stockings. There are also some senior centres, the Martha House and I know Grandview Village. They also donate, but there are a lot of other sewers in the community that once they know, we usually advertise in the quilt shops, the sewing shops, so people know that we're looking for them, and they're very generous, and they give us the stockings, so that's great. We've had over 1,000 this year, which is wonderful, because we had to stuff 650, which was bigger than last year. So.
The project is sponsored by Friends of Chinook Regional Hospital, which donates money to buy the stocking stuffers. Now, this is the time of year when we're thinking about special gifts to give to our loved ones during the Christmas holiday season. Canadian Blood Services wants you to give the gift of life.
I donate blood because I'm constantly hearing about how there's shortages all the time, and I feel like it's almost a civic duty to voting to donate blood. And I think that one of the best gifts of all this season is to give blood. It's not as scary as you think. You don't have to look at the needle when it's going in, and that's the scariest part by far. There's not nearly as many restrictions as you think there are, and it's quite accessible.
The most common blood type is O positive. Those with O negative blood are considered universal blood donors because patients of all blood types can receive O negative blood. The City of Lethbridge has teamed up with the Girl Guides and Pathfinders for this year's Christmas tree collection. On Saturday, January 11th, you can put your tree out in the front or in the back alley, and the Girl Guides will be by to pick them up. Depending on weather, the collection will take place over a few days. The trees will then be chipped and used for mulch. The annual Christmas tree collection is a fundraiser to support various youth groups in the city. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he is not convinced that decriminalizing hard drugs killing thousands of Canadians each year is a solution to the country's opioid epidemic. Trudeau says tackling the drug problem in our country requires a complex solution.
I think the approach on harder drugs needs to be different than just legalization. I think we have certainly allowed for a little more flexibility around medical approaches, around what doctors can prescribe as alternatives. We've moved forward significantly on safe consumption. We understand, and we've given more supports to frontline workers and are trying to help the families who've been devastated by this terrible opioid epidemic, that very real challenge of meth as well in certain parts of the country as well. And we're going to keep working on that.
Just over $300 million worth of cocaine was seized from smugglers, was offloaded yesterday in San Diego, California. The haul resulted from operations by U.S. Coast Guard cutters between mid-October and early December.
United States Coast Guard, Mount Arriba.
Looks like what might be a bale right there. Looks like 2 bales underneath here, underneath the console. What? A third. Yeah, this place is loaded.
This is hard, dangerous work for these crews to actually gain access and control of those vessels. And then there's a lot of just hard labor to get all of these narcotics off of those small boats that the narco traffickers are using onto the flight deck. There's evidentiary rules and tracking, and it's all nicely neat and bundled behind us, but this represents a lot of work and effort by the crew. The problem is big, and cocaine production continues. The cultivation of cocaine continues to grow in South America, so the denominator continues to increase.
An Ontario court dismissed the charges of assault and sexual assault against Afghanistan hostage Joshua Boyle today. An Ontario court judge says the Crown failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Boyle committed the offenses against his wife, Caitlin Coleman. Boyle's lawyer says the ruling sets the stage for his client to now fight for custody of their 4 children. When it comes to our national defense, are we spending enough? Especially when it comes to our support of NATO. Canada currently spends around 1.3% of its GDP on the armed forces. Christian Leuprecht is a security expert and professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and at Queen's University. He says even though there are calls for Canada to spend 2% or more on defense, that money could potentially be spent elsewhere.
If you think about this differently, it's 25 billion Canadian dollars. And it's a little bit over a quarter of direct federal government program spending. And of course, every dollar that we spend on defense is a dollar that we don't have to spend on other federal government priorities, whether that's healthcare, education, infrastructure, transfers to the provinces, you name it.
Catch the full interview with security expert Christian Leuprecht discussing national security coming up in the second half of our show. 10 years ago, on December 30th, a massive roadside bomb in Afghanistan destroyed a Canadian Forces troop carrier, killing 4 soldiers and a journalist. Bushra Saeed Khan, a 25-year-old diplomat, and 4 soldiers were injured. Saeed Khan reflects on her long, winding road to recovery a decade after the blast.
I just remember the loudest sound I've ever heard. It wasn't like an explosion you hear on, a traditional explosion you hear on TV when you're watching a movie. It was just a very extremely loud cracking sound. My biggest concern was the Taliban coming and taking hostages. Like, I didn't see blood or anything like that, just pieces. When people ask, I try to explain that the amputation was the least of my injuries. It was the most visible. You know, the scarring that didn't enable me to move, and it took a month for me to stretch out the scars on my stomach to be able to lie flat so I could stand up straight.
I can see, or maybe I can't see it, but I know the amount of fear I had about what my future would be. It was a little bit of an obsession for me, that I did not know what to expect. Would I be as active as I was before? Would I be able to raise a family? Would I, put my family through more than I already have? Was it going to get much worse before it got better? And at points, looking back, it did. I wish I could go back and tell that 25-year-old, it's going to be okay. It's going to be difficult, but you'll get through this, and not to go down the rabbit holes that I went down over the last 10 years. I remember my psychologist saying, it would take at least 4 years for you to feel normal again. And then after 4 years passing, still not feeling exactly comfortable with everything. To be completely honest, it's only been in the last year or two that I really feel like everything is okay again. But I remember thinking, if I can't have children, I don't want to think about surviving. But having my daughter this year was something that I had been thinking about for so long and always wondering if it would be possible. So once I was able to have time with her and know that it was possible for me to raise a baby girl, that was something that was really monumental for me to say, to know that, okay, things are okay. And now she's almost 11 months. She'll be 1 year old a week before the 10-year anniversary. I don't think life should be measured in successes and wins. I think efforts and attempts are important, if not more important. Because, at the end of the day, when I look back on my life, I want to know that at least I made an effort to try to make the world a better place and to try to improve things. And that will come at a cost, whether it's time or financially or health. I don't think as Canadians we can just stand idle knowing that our neighbors in the international community can live without some of the privileges that we have.
It was on this day that U.S. President Bill Clinton was impeached. Charles Dickens' novel A Christmas Carol is first published, and Apollo 17 splashes down in the Pacific Ocean. This is Today in History for December 19th.
December 19th, 1998. In Washington, Bill Clinton becomes the second American president to be impeached by the House of Representatives. The Republican-controlled House impeaches Democrat Clinton for perjury and obstruction of justice over the Monica Lewinsky scandal.
We must stop the politics of personal destruction.
The following February, Clinton is acquitted by the Republican-controlled Senate and finishes the rest of his term in office. 1777, an iconic chapter of the Revolutionary War. General George Washington leads his Continental Army of about 11,000 men to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, to camp for the winter. 1843, Bah Humbug, Charles Dickens' novel A Christmas Carol, the tale of Ebenezer Scrooge, Tiny Tim, and the holiday spirit, is first published in Britain. 1972, Apollo 17 splashes down in the Pacific Ocean, bringing the last of America's manned missions to the moon to an end. In 1957, in New York, The Music Man, starring Robert Preston as Professor Harold Hill, opens on Broadway. Today in History, December 19th. Rita Foley, The Associated Press.
The world's largest menorah was put together and then put on display in New York City yesterday. The 36-foot, 4,000-pound menorah was recognized and certified by the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest in the world. It is used to hold candles on the Jewish holiday known as Hanukkah. That is one big menorah. Nice to see the sun shine and feel a little bit milder today with the temperatures. The mercury will be climbing even more over the next few days. A full look at the weather picture is coming up. We had lots of sunshine and blue sky in many parts of southwestern Alberta again today. Tonight, a few clouds developing with a low near -1. Tomorrow, a mixture of sun and cloud with the temperature increasing to 11. Lots of sunshine and 11 degrees again on Saturday. The clouds return with the mercury dropping to 5 degrees on Sunday. Even cooler under a mainly cloudy sky with a high of only -1 for Monday. Tuesday, mostly sunny and -1 again. Wednesday, warming up slightly to 0. Checking the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 0 and an average low of -12. The highest temperature of this date was recorded in 1954 at 16 degrees, and the record low, a very chilly -34 in 1983. Sunrise was at 8:25, sunset at 4:32. Let's see how tomorrow's shaping up across the country now. Expect rain and a high of 8 degrees for both Victoria and Vancouver. Mostly cloudy and 7 is on tap for Calgary. Clouds and +1 for Edmonton on Friday. Mainly sunny and +1 as well for Regina and Saskatoon. Overcast and -9 degrees for Winnipeg tomorrow. Clearing and -4 in Toronto. A cool -10 for Ottawa. A few clouds and -10 as well for Montreal. Over the Maritimes, Fredericton, New Brunswick will have a mixture of sun and cloud and should get up to -2. Clouds and -1 for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Light flurries and +1 for Charlottetown, PEI. And at St. John's, Newfoundland, expect snow and a high of only -1 tomorrow. The recent report and recommendations from the Blue Ribbon Panel on Alberta's finances suggest that public sector workers earn more than those in other provinces and suggest the government could reduce the size of the public sector. Richard Mueller is an economics professor at the U of L, and he gave his take on if public sector workers are better off in Alberta or other provinces.
My best estimates show that public sector is paid about 3.7% more than comparable people in the private sector. A lot of people would argue that's because the private sector, or the public sector, gets the cream of the crop. They're able to attract good people. There's long queues for job openings, and so the government can basically, or its agencies can pick the best people.
The AUPE has around 95,000 members in Alberta, most of which are employed in the public sector. General Motors is winding down production at its assembly plant in Oshawa, Ontario. Some workers gathered to call for more government action to save the plant. GM announced in November of last year that it would be winding down production at the plant, which has been in operation since 1953. The company first started producing vehicles in 1918.
We are here because today General Motors is assembling their last vehicle in Oshawa after vehicles have been produced in this community for 111 years. They are leaving despite Canadians giving them $11 billion in 2009 to keep good jobs in this community. They took that money, only $8 billion was returned, and they're still leaving. They demanded concessions from workers and from retirees, which they got, and they're still leaving.
Speaking of General Motors, the company is recalling more than 814,000 vehicles across North America to fix problems with electronic brake controls and battery cables. The first recall covers just over 464,000 Cadillac CT6 sedans, along with the Chevy Silverado and GMC Sierra trucks built in 2019. The company says a software error can disable the electronic stability control and anti-lock brake systems. The second recall covers over 350,000 2019 and 2020 Silverado and Sierra 1500 pickups. A cable connecting the battery and alternator may have too much glue on it, which could interrupt the electrical connection and possibly cause a fire. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he was happy to hear that workers at SNC-Lavalin will not suffer as a result of the company's guilty plea to a criminal charge in a Montreal court yesterday. Trudeau says when it comes to the SNC-Lavalin affair, he really should have played things a little bit differently, but there are no do-overs in politics.
This process unfolded in an independent way, and we got to an outcome that seems positive for everyone involved, particularly for the workers. But obviously, we'll continue to keep an eye on ensuring that workers are being protected across the country. Obviously, as we look back over the past year in this issue, there are things we could have, should have, would have done differently had we known. Have we known all sorts of different aspects of it. But you don't get do-overs in politics. You only, do the best you can to protect jobs, to respect the independence of the judiciary, and that's exactly what we did every step of the way.
Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up 32 points on the day to 17,064. The Dow was up 137 points to 28,376. The S&P 500 was up 14 points to 3205. The Nasdaq was up 59 points on the day to 8887. Oil was up 29 cents to 61.22 per barrel. Natural gas was unchanged at $2.29. Gold was up a nickel to $14.7886 per ounce, and silver was unchanged at $17.07 an ounce. Wheat is at $227 per metric ton, barley's at $230, canola's at $4.59, and corn is at $276 per metric ton. Live cattle were down 13 cents on the day to $122.73. Feeder cattle were up 18 cents to $145.45. Lean hogs were up $1.08 to $71. The Canadian dollar was down slightly on the day to 76.17 US. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, for only the third time in U.S. history, an American president has been impeached. The House of Representatives voted to approve the 2 articles of impeachment against Donald Trump. They were abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. It stemmed from whether or not Trump improperly sought help from Ukraine to boost his chances of re-election in 2020. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is waiting for the Senate to indicate how it will handle the 2 articles of impeachment before she transmits them. It appears as though anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States. 5 people were shot and killed recently at a kosher grocery store in New Jersey. Our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari has details next with BCN's Paul Arthur. But first, here's a look what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News Community Calendar. Make Christmas special for a child in need. Center Village Mall Toy Mountain is accepting donations of new unwrapped toys until December 20th during mall hours. All toys will be distributed through the joint efforts of the Christmas Hope campaign. For details, visit christmashope.ca. Come for a beautiful and reflective time at the Christmas Eve candlelight service at City Light Church on December 24th from 5 to 6 p.m. Celebrate the birth of our Savior by gathering together for a time of singing and hearing about the miraculous events that took place on that special night. Let's remember that Jesus is the reason for the season. Warm your hearts this season and come enjoy the Winter Light Festival at the Nikayuko Japanese Garden until January 31st. Gates are open from 6 to 9 p.m. Experience the illumination of over 100,000 lights decorating the beautifully shaped trees and garden. Admission is $9 for adults, $7 for kids ages 6 to 15, and various ticket packages are also available. For more information, visit nikayuko.com. And that's your Bridge City News Community Calendar.
Well, it's been a busy week with global events, and joining us from Los Angeles via Skype is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari. Hi, Lisa. Good to have you with us. Let's begin with the recent Jersey City shootings. Now, the mayor says the real target of this anti-Semitic shooting may have been the neighboring yeshiva with some 50 children there. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's a scary thought. And if there were any doubts as to whether or not these assailants were anti-Semitic, and if this was a targeted hate crime, now we have so many reasons to believe that this was absolutely anti-Semitic in nature, and they were targeting Jews. Not only targeting Jews, but they would have gone after 50 innocent children just because of their faith. It's scary times. We're almost upon 2020, and to have these kinds of headlines over and over again, for someone to be able to target a group like that, to have so much hatred, to target the community supermarket, to go after children just because of their specific faith and the way that they worship is just unbelievable. We're going to be hearing more and more details out of this, and it's always this, there's pros and cons. The more that these stories are told, it's almost as though we're seeing more copycat attacks. Similar in nature for those who kind of have grievances against any group, feel like this is the time to share those grievances and act upon them in very, very violent and tragic ways. So it's awful, but the more we can raise awareness about this, I'll be speaking at a forum here in Los Angeles on Wednesday night about anti-Semitism. I think there are many communities now that are trying to really spread the word and create an awareness for all people of all faiths and all races and all ethnicities. And again, it's scary that this is 2020, and we have to remind people that it's okay to have differences.
Yeah, exactly. It is sad. Again, we hear this never again, right? We think back to the Holocaust, and here it is happening again around the world in so many ways. It's just something needs to change here. We need to learn from history. Now, protests turning violent in Lebanon. Can you explain what's behind all of that unrest?
Sure. It's interesting because we saw this surge of protests around the Middle East in 2010. That was what we called the Arab Spring. And the kind of liftoff of the Arab Spring took place in 2009 with the Iran Green Revolution. And what happened at that time? It was this feeling of we can do better. We know better. We're on the internet. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter, we're on YouTube, we're seeing what's going on around the world, and now we're educated people, and the the monarchies or the theocracies or the government that we know no longer suits us. We want better. Now we're seeing a second surge of that all around the world. I mean, everywhere you look, there are headlines about protests going on every continent. Latin America, we see protests going on in many countries. In Europe, in France, the protests are still going strong. In the Middle East, of course, they are in perpetual protest mode. And of course, we're seeing that in Iraq, in Iran, and now Lebanon. And Paul, in Lebanon, we hadn't heard much about Lebanon except for the rise and the surge of Hezbollah, the Iranian proxy terror organization operating there like a cancerous cell. Now the people of Lebanon are saying, we want this terror cell out. Not only do we want this terror cell out, we want our government out because we want to be modern, we want to be secular, we want it all. And to their to their case, it's that the people of Lebanon are different in the Middle East. They're highly educated. They have equal rights. There's not there's less of this influence of Sharia law there. So you do have a chance for the people to modernize and move forward. And this is what they're telling the world.
Now, obviously, there's been some violence there from the government toward the protesters. What are the odds, I guess, of this actually having some good fruit to it? Will it come to a place of peace where, yes, they are going to make some changes, you think?
This has always been the question for the Middle East. Is the devil that we know better than the devil that we don't know? And could these political vacuums, if created, and if these governments are removed, who's to take the place? And in the case of many of these countries, there's no viable government to come next, and there's no ability on the part of the people to nation build because they haven't done it for generations. They've just known one government, and it has been an infallible government that has been, ruling over, and in most cases in the form of a dictatorship. The case of Lebanon, it's a bit more mild, and the people have a bit more ability to do that, to vote. They have been doing so. They have more of a chance, and with they have neighboring Israel to look at as an example of building somewhat of a democracy. And of course, democracy not by what we define it in the West, but what they would define as what comes as close to a democracy as possible for the Middle East. So in the case of Lebanon, I would say that there is a chance for at least their grievances to be heard, or for at least for them to ask for something and to get at least a bit of what they're asking for, if not all of it. So I think, what we saw in Egypt, for example, with the Arab Spring, it was that they came out, they didn't get what they really wanted, and they came out again. And I think the people of Lebanon or the people of Hong Kong or the people of Iran, they all show us this example of, we're not afraid to come back out onto the streets. So once you have the people or the population showing that they're not afraid to come back out onto the streets, that's something that's very, very serious and very, very much of an Achilles heel for the government. So I think that they'll want to do something about this. They'll want to at least hear the people out and make some changes to that so that they can go forward in some sort of stable way.
Turkey, the country, could close an American air base in the face of, U.S. threats of sanctions, I guess. And this air base has nukes on it as well, I understand. And this ties in with the Senate passing a resolution which recognizes the Armenian genocide. Do you think Turkey would actually do this, or is it kind of, more, a bit of a tool to stop the sanctions?
It could be a tool or some sort of, chest thumping to say, you can't do this to us. Look, Turkey has been riding a very comfortable wave with regarding U.S. foreign policy. They've been a frenemy of the United States, a friend and enemy at the same time for a very long time. Under President Obama, they were just getting the checks. They didn't have to really be any bit of there wasn't any loyalty. We didn't call them out on anything, only because of these bases. Turkey has a geographic advantage that the U.S. has always wanted to use and have at its disposal, giving us a kind of a footstep in the Middle East, very close to Syria and Iran and Iraq and all the places where we want to be. But on the other hand, it seems like Turkey has been the one calling the shots. They get the financial aid, the foreign aid, and they also call the shots. And in this case, with President Trump, who's been trying to put on a friendly face and a friendly handshake towards Erdogan when he invited him to the White House not too long ago, he's still going to sanction them when they do bad things to the Kurds. And when when the Senate passed this resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide, I mean, that's a sore spot for the people of Turkey. So I think that the one thing that the Turks know they have over the United States are these air bases. So that's what they're threatening to do, and they know that that's where it's going to hurt the U.S. with regards to our foreign policy and our motions in the region. So, this has been a long time coming. I think the U.S. has wanted to confront Turkey on many things. I think whatever deal was cut between President Trump and Erdogan with regards to the Syria pullout, the U.S. is not happy with the way that the Turks handled it, and they sanctioned them. So I think that there has to be a serious conversation as to if you're getting the foreign aid, there has to be an alignment of interests as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're strange bedfellows, the U.S. and Turkey, that's for sure. But yeah, I guess we'll see what happens here, and if they do in fact impose more sanctions here, wow. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. 2 Chinese diplomats expelled after breaching a U.S. military base here. Now, it's kind of a more of a quiet expulsion, though, wasn't it?
Yes, because, it doesn't look good for anybody, right? We're already on a very tumultuous path to cutting a deal with the Chinese. At the same time, it doesn't look good for our security apparatus to have these, Chinese people walking around. One of them was, this woman, if you remember the story from a while back, kind of walked onto Mar-a-Lago and was able to kind of have all of this recording apparatus on her. And in this case, these 2 individuals, they went onto the base and they claimed that they didn't understand when the guard was telling them not to move and go for any further. So obvious trespassing and obvious, reason for skepticism when it comes to China and when it comes to this specific crime, for lack of a better word, where the Chinese want to infiltrate. That's really their goal, whether it's in stealing technology or stealing patents or getting information. This is what they want to do. They want to infiltrate. So that's why this was a quiet expulsion. Get out. We don't want to ask any more questions. We don't want to know anymore, but you just can't be here.
Again, strange bedfellows, right? With this tension in the relationship with the this, giant trade partner in China. And briefly, do you want to touch base on phase 1 of their trade deal here? It stops, I guess, the taxes going up, I guess, against China. But is it going to go somewhere, you think?
Well, hopefully for Donald Trump, it'll go somewhere, because I think all eyes are on China and whether this deal is going to go through. The reasons why it would go through is because, again, the incentive is for Donald Trump to push this through, to improve an already roaring economy here in the United States, to lessen the tariffs and increase the exports out to China, and to obviously lessen the blow for those who import goods from China into the United States. Obviously, these two countries are very natural trade partners, especially as of late, where everything comes from China, right? Now, phase 1 is done, and what I'm hearing is that they've kind of cut out the rest of the deal as well, and it looks pretty good. Whether or not to believe that, we know that phase 1 is done, but phase 1 is easy. What becomes difficult is that the Chinese are not willing to concede on points that involve what I said before, and that involve, again, stealing of technology, stealing of patents, intellectual property. That's exactly the where they kind of are like, wait a minute, we almost can't stop cheating. So I think the U.S. wants to put a very a more strict control on these aspects, and lessen the tariffs, because everyone wins. If this deal should go through, both sides will win, but the Chinese have to be willing to concede, and the U.S. knows that they have the upper hand when it comes to this deal, and they're going to hold Chinese to it.
Well, let's play fair. Yeah, it sounds good. Okay, I'm out of time here. Thank you, as always, Lisa, for your insight into these issues.
My pleasure.
Canada has been under pressure from the United States to contribute our fair share to NATO. Should we be upping our game a little bit? Do we rely a little too heavily on the United States to defend us? Joining me now to talk about this is Christian Leukprecht. He's a security expert and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Joining me from Kingston. Christian, welcome back to BCN.
Thank you.
Now, before we get into what Canada's contributions to NATO should be, can you explain to our viewers exactly what the role of NATO really is?
So inherently, NATO is primarily seen by people as a military alliance. And so as an effort to get countries together and to pool resources, think about the economies of alliances where as overcoming collective action problems, you put everybody's resources together and presumably you have more than if you just added them all up individually. But there's a lot more to NATO than that, because it's also meant as the famous first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay, said, what's the role of NATO is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And thus keeping the Americans in is critical because it signaled from the beginning that one of the challenges was always going to be to make sure the Americans stayed on board and that the Americans were always going to be an ambiguous partner in this undertaking at best, and that all the other members would have to work hard to make sure the Americans would remain part of the alliance. And of course, the first crisis we have about what's known as burden sharing, so what everybody's contributing, dates back to John Foster Dulles, 1953 in December. So we've been at these conversations about NATO, what everybody should contribute, and how best to posture the organization for a very long time. But of course, it is the 70th anniversary of NATO this year, and it shows that the organization, despite many changes in the world, has proven itself very resilient. And I think it has done so precisely because it is useful and has proven useful in asserting and defending our interests, our values, our prosperity, and our democratic way of life.
Yeah, at the recent NATO meetings, Canada got some pressure from U.S. President Donald Trump to step up to the plate and contribute much more to NATO. I think he said something around 2% of our GDP. How much are we actually putting in now, and should we actually maybe be putting a little bit more in?
So since 2014, the NATO Wales Summit, there's been an overall increase in NATO defense spending among collectively and among most of the allies. And this was sort of a recognition that the international security environment has changed, and so that everybody needs to be spending a little bit more. Now, how much more, of course, is difficult to say, because if we think about defense spending, I think of it as a sort of insurance policy. It's a premium that you pay because in case the house burns down, you want to make sure that you're covered. And that depends on how you perceive the international security environment. And so if you're a country such as Canada, then the risks are perhaps perceived, at least, as being a little bit lower than if you're a country such as the United States. And so that's also partially where these debates stem from. But this idea of 2% was always an aspirational goal. We currently spend 1.3% roughly. We intend to ramp that up to 1.4% perhaps by 2023-24. But ultimately, this is, if you think about this differently, it's 25 billion Canadian dollars. And it's a little bit over a quarter of direct federal government program spending. And of course, every dollar that we spend on defense is a dollar that we don't have to spend on other federal government priorities, whether that's healthcare, education, infrastructure, transfers to the provinces, you name it. And so Canadian politicians have always been very savvy at trying to balance what's sort of the minimum that you have to spend for the maximum effect that you want to get. A colleague of mine called this the Walmart approach to Canadian defense policy. You know, you don't want to go too low, but you also don't need to get the Cadillac version and sort of just kind of what's just right. The question is, of course, given the continued pressure on the changing security environment, and I think what awaits us over the next 25 years will probably be even more challenging than what we had over the last 25 years. And the what's sometimes called the rusting out of Canadian equipment, so many challenges in terms of renewal for the Canadian Armed Forces, it probably suggests that if we want to continue to be a value player, we will likely have to make a more considerable investment in national defense, or our capabilities are going to decline fairly precipitously in the coming years.
So, Christian, where does Canada rank within NATO countries when it comes to contribution levels? Are we in the middle, maybe near the bottom?
So that depends entirely on how you measure. So in terms of authorized troop strength, we're the 8th largest military within NATO. We're in the top 20 militaries in the world. In terms of GDP spending, we're in the bottom third of NATO countries. But there's really only, in terms of absolute numbers, a handful of countries that spend more. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, all of which are much larger countries by population and also significantly larger economies. And on a per capita basis, it's the United States, Norway, the United Kingdom, Denmark, the Netherlands, France, Germany, and Greece. So about half the NATO member countries, not quite, that spend more. So it's entirely depends on how you measure. But on many of these measures, Canada doesn't actually look as impoverished in its defense spending as some of the critics in the United States would make it out to be. Keep also in mind, of course, that we can have conversations about where Canada ranks, but we can also have conversations about how much the United States is spending. It is often said that in the United States, defense spending is essentially equalization. All other federations have equalization programs. The United States is the only federation, advanced industrialized democratic federation, that does not. And so the significant defense spending means that every state in the United States gets a significant base and gets a significant part of the of military industrial R&D or manufacturing capacity. Think also of the immense healthcare costs in the United States that we've distributed differently in Canada. And so there are also explanations why, compared to the Americans, we look significantly lower, that are not necessarily attributable solely to what is actually being spent on defense.
So obviously Canada is not going to be a heavyweight in NATO like the United States, but really what should we be striving towards? Should we be maybe spending more on fighter jets, drones, ships, or even tanks?
So I think this is a very apt conversation, because over the last 15 years, the Canadian Armed Forces have done a lot of counterterrorism missions in various capacities, whether that's as advise and assist missions in northern Iraq or in Afghanistan, whether that's the early combat missions in Afghanistan, or whether it's the special forces missions in Northwest Africa. And it turns out that we've kind of forgotten to do a whole lot of other things. And so I think the challenge going forward for the Canadian Armed Forces is going to be to make sure that it can remain a comprehensive, full-spectrum military that can deliver on whatever mandates and requests it gets from the Prime Minister. And so that means, I think, thinking not so much just in terms of things that fly, things that float, or things that drive, but it means thinking about what are the challenges that we're likely to see in the 21st century that are rather unconventional challenges. Consider the cyber attacks and cyber environment to which we're exposed to on a daily basis. Consider that if you buy a fighter jet, but that fighter jet doesn't have a capacity for compressed data download, it is largely useless in a 21st century fighting environment. And so it means that we need to also rethink about how it is that the Canadian Armed Forces need to fight in the 21st century, what challenges they're likely to face, and how they can best confront those challenges. And that means, I think, thinking less just in terms of kit, and also in terms of what effects we will need to achieve with that kit and with the people behind the kit, because of course it means in a highly technological environment, those highly qualified personnel are also in high demand by the private sector. And so being able to recruit, maintain, generate, and employ that highly qualified force is an increasing challenge for the Canadian Armed Forces to remain competitive.
What about the Arctic? I mean, Russia certainly has interest in increasing its authority and presence there. How well is Canada positioned to really assert our authority there?
Yeah, the Arctic is a significant challenge. It depends on how you see the Arctic, whether you see it as a cooperative environment in terms of search and rescue and the environment where we have very, shall we say, cordial relations with Russia, and we have joint agreements with Russia through the Arctic Council, whether you see it as a competitive environment, for instance, for resources, whether that's with Russia, the United States, or even China that is now showing up in the Arctic, or whether you see it as an adversarial environment where you see Russia as a possible contender and adversary. And so how you answer that question very much depends what resources you invest in. If you look at the mandate letter for the Minister of National Defense, clearly the Arctic plays an important role, and the ability on the one hand to have intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets and the ability to respond, as well as the NORAD renewal, much of which is going to necessarily happen in the Arctic, is important and significant. But I think in the age of great power competition, the Arctic is simply a secondary theater to the broader competition. And in great power competition terms, that always means nuclear competition, nuclear weapons, and nuclear power. And so it means the capability in the Arctic to be able to intercept a brand new generation of nuclear weapons, sometimes known as the third nuclear age, of hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missiles and hypersonic cruise missiles. That's ultimately the next challenge. And so if there is a conflict in the Arctic, it would likely be a secondary and spillover effect from perhaps a conflict due to great power competition elsewhere in the world. And so that's ultimately what the Canadian Armed Forces need to be prepared for. But it's not really an environment, I think, where anybody really wants to fight a war or contend a conflict, but we need to be prepared for the possibility that spillover effect may become a reality and be prepared for that.
How much of a difference does NATO really make? If there was actually an attack on a NATO country, would this coalition of countries actually join forces, spend huge bucks, and maybe risk lives?
Well, this is what Article 5 is ultimately about, and this is what Emmanuel Macron alluded to with his comments about NATO being brain dead. Notice that he didn't say dead, he said brain dead, and this was in reference to some of the US actions in Syria and withdrawal there that was perceived as perhaps not the United States not necessarily making good on their Article 5 commitments. Now, of course, I'm not so convinced about that, because the only country that has ever benefited really from the Article 5 is, of course, after 9/11, when Article 5 was called in. It was called in by no other country than Canada. And so the United States understand that they, just like with burden sharing, may eventually be the greatest beneficiary from Article 5. And so I think the United States will continue to have an interest in providing that deterrent effect and reassuring the member states that when push comes to shove, they're actually going to be there for them. Remember that as much as Washington likes to think that the world is all about the United States, it is really still all about Europe. And until the Second World War, the United States was a regional power. And it's only since the United States has been able to control Europe that the United States has become a superpower. The contest is really still in the world very much about who controls Europe. And so the United States have a key interest in the unity, harmony, and the territorial integrity of European NATO member allies. Various remarks, I think, by the current US administration notwithstanding.
Now, when you take a look at some of the more aggressive countries around the world, which do you see as the most likely to even start a war? Maybe North Korea, Russia, Iran? What are your thoughts? China?
The challenge in this environment is that how you understand a war, that in a kinetic environment, if we think about that great power conflict is really still a nuclear conflict, the ultimate deterrent remains mutual assured destruction. And that's what ultimately will prevent a country such as North Korea from getting the wrong idea, because they know they would be wiped off the face of the earth if they try to send one of those missiles in the direction of North America. On the other hand, you can argue that we are already in a very significant war on a daily basis, which is in cyberspace and the electronic warfare space, where we on a daily basis are exposed to various attacks by adversaries that intentionally keep those attacks below the threshold of the implication of international law, below the threshold of NATO Article 5 collective defense, and therefore also below the threshold of the application of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, for instance. And so that's what makes this conflict in cyberspace so dangerous, because it means it's very much an anarchic environment where each and every day adversaries attack us, try to attack our critical infrastructure. We see some of this bubbling up to the surface when it comes, for instance, to conversations about our democratic institutions and our democratic processes. And there's a real risk of the attempts by our adversaries to go after our critical infrastructure systems in one way or another to spill over into a kinetic conflict. And so it's this uncontrolled cyber environment that we already live a hot conflict on a daily basis that probably poses the greatest risk of then subsequently spilling over into a kinetic conflict that no one may ultimately be able to control because of the broader unintended consequences of how irresponsibly some of our adversaries are behaving in the information environment.
Christian Leuprecht is a security expert and a professor at the Royal Military College of Canada and at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.